Good afternoon, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started for our March 23rd session. Okay, at this time, please type present for your attendance in chat. If you did not sign in with your full name, be sure to include it in the message. Great. Okay, I know there's some testing going on for a few people today, so we may not see a full class. All right, moving on. Okay, what I want to cover real quickly is some of the activities that you guys did for the midterm checkup. We had this test. I called it an activity. It was just a checkup to see how you guys were doing with some of the material. And I want to go over that real quickly with you and also do a few items for clarification. The test average score was an 82, a low B. The average test time was approximately 12 hours to 27 minutes, meaning that most of you guys had it open or closed, but the average time was about 12 hours or so. There were approximately 21 individuals, I believe, that were the test takers for the sample. And looking at some of the items I wanted to make sure that we clarified before we moved on. Remember, we will be having a big exam at the end of this course, which will be another cumulative comprehensive exam for the entirety of the course. This is sort of like a preview in a sense. Now, a couple of items for clarification. We had one dealing with phrenology. And I want to make sure you understood that phrenology, which is that pseudoscience of being able to look at somebody's skull with the bumps and indentations and find out about their character. It did sort of suggest the idea of what we call brain localization. That means that certain areas of the brain were responsible for certain types of behaviors or characteristics, okay? Also, just another item of clarification, males and females, there was an item there about how many chromosomes we have in common. There are 46 chromosomes for a human, and 45 of those chromosomes for males and females we have in common. So there's only one chromosome that determines all the other differences that we see, the primary and secondary differences between males and females. Okay, going on. Most of you got this correct, even though there was a question when it comes to the test bank here. Most neural signals are excitatory. I didn't like the particular language that question had, but what it comes down to is that, remember, the key thing about excitatory or inhibitory neurons are going to be the transmitters, the neurotransmitter. Glutamate, which is an excitatory, over 90% of the synapses in the human brain are geared for that. And the next most prevalent is GABA, which is inhibitory. At more than 90% of those who do not use glutamate are using that. But so that is correct that most of the neural signals that we'll see are going to be excitatory. Now, the other thing I want to make sure we understood is that psychology, initially, when we started calling it a science, an academic discipline, it was focused primarily on consciousness. It wasn't until a little bit later that we started focusing a lot more on behavior, and the behaviorist movement came about and was a major influence on us. But it did start off looking at consciousness, differences in consciousness. Also, a couple other things, social attitudes change throughout our life, unlike our temperament. Temperament is that sort of degree of intensity and sensitivity that we seem to be born with, because we see temperaments early in our life before we were able to learn anything like that. So, but social attitudes do tend to change. So we'll have one social attitude when we're in college, we're young and fresh, but as we get older, our social attitudes are most likely going to be different. And then the other item that we saw some difficulty with was the one dealing with our ability to put together, doing parallel processing, these different component parts. And we use the term bind. We bind the separate but parallel pieces of information together to get our perception. And there was an issue there with the wording and the language. I wanted to make some little bit of clarification about the word bind and the word combine. Bind makes things sound sort of stuck together but still separate. So that was one of the things there, that they were bringing these things together, but they're still separate things. And when we talk about combine, it sort of makes things sound infused with each other, like we combine ingredients to make something totally different. And that was the slight difference that we saw in the language there. It was splitting hairs, but you may have noted that I did give you guys credit for it. I did change the grade slightly for those two items dealing with the excitatory neural signals and the one dealing with binding. Now, the lesson learned from this, from previous exams that you guys have had, you performed quite well in those exams. You were given less time and more items and scored on average 95%. This time with this midterm checkup activity, you were given much more time. The time was open. You had fewer items, about 10 or so, and your average was 82. Anyone want to comment on what that might mean? Anyone? Well, it tends to suggest to me that you guys need a little bit more stress because you probably went into the midterm checkup activity with a lot less anxiety and stress. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in a future chapter on motivation, where there is this belief that in order to perform well on certain types of things, you need to have at least a certain level of stress that optimizes your performance. So we'll talk more about that and hopefully bring this up again. But I think you guys can perform much better on a cumulative exam than what we see here. Okay, any questions before I move on? Okay. So the next thing I want to cover real quickly is what we did during our last class session. We were talking about and wrapping up the chapter on learning, and we were covering operant conditioning and punishment and applications. Now, operant conditioning, OC, we talked about reinforcement schedules. We were talking about fixed and variable interval schedules, fixed and variable ratio schedules, so interval based on time, ratio based on how many performances or events that we perform, and then we get the reinforcer based on that. We then introduce the idea of punishment. Now, remember the difference between reinforcement and punishment. When we reinforce something, there's going to be some sort of target behavior that's going to go up. That's the definition of reinforcement. We do some sort of target behavior is going to go up. When we talk about punishment, a target behavior is going to go down. Okay, remember that. So when we talk about punishment, we talked about positive or negative. We talked about the effectiveness of punishment and also about problems with physical punishment, that it has some particular downsides to it. One of the things that we do see is that when we do implement, let's say, physical punishment for someone, it does potentially teach them about particular types of aggressive behavior or aggressive acts. So when it comes to punishment and about how we learn things, we can learn aggressive acts. Now, we see here the photographs here of the Bobo doll study, where young people, nursery-age children, were able to learn aggressive behavior and strike Bobo doll under the right circumstances. All right. We also saw that applications of operant conditioning, we see applications applied at school, in the sports venue, as well as in the work world. So we see a strong case for operant conditioning all over the place. It's utilized on a daily basis in many different types of arenas. Now, we also wanted to look real quickly at biology and conditioning. Now, the key thing here that I wanted to emphasize is that when we talk about biology and things of that nature, look at the dog. The dog there, he's balancing himself, but what it comes down to is that we can condition animals to do lots of things. We can condition humans to do lots of things, but we can condition animals to do certain things, but only when it's something within their repertoire, within their behavioral set. So we can't teach them that something totally foreign to them and condition them to do it. We teach dogs to become canine and bomb sniffers and drug dog sniffers because they sniff. That's what they tend to do. And so it's within their biological protocol, so to speak, for them to learn those types of things. And then finally, we talked about pro-social and antisocial. Pro-social behaviors we can learn If our parents, for example, take us to soup kitchens on holidays so that we can volunteer, we learn those types of behaviors. But we can also learn antisocial stuff as well. Being, for example, what we see in the Bobo doll, we see acts of violence on television or in the movies, and then we can mimic those types of behaviors as well. Now, in summary, let's look at the top right corner of this particular slide, the types of consequences. At the top column, we have adding stimuli and subtracting stimuli. Regardless of what we talk about, reinforcement or punishment, we have positive reinforcement and positive punishment. Adding stimuli, that's what we mean by positive. Subtracting stimuli is what we mean by negative. So let's look at this real quickly. Adding stimuli, positive reinforcement, we get candy. So you're adding candy to the mix. They behave a certain way, you give them candy. That's going to be reinforcing. Okay, so that's going to strengthen that target behavior. Okay, now let's look at the opposite. We have positive punishment. You do some sort of behavior and then you get spanked, you get hit. Okay, that's going to be something that is undesirable, unpleasant stimuli for you, and you'll do less of that target behavior. And so the idea here is that we add or subtract something, and the thing that we add or subtract can be either desirable stimuli or unpleasant stimuli, and that's what gives us this little matrix up here of things that will either strengthen our target behavior or reduce our target behavior. That's what we covered last time, and this time we're going to be following up that with a conversation on memory. Now, before we go to memory, also you should note that I added a few things for you to work on for activities for chapter 7 and 8. And I went ahead and put some in there for some additional ones as well, I think for 6 as well. Some puzzles. And I want to see how you guys work on these puzzles. We'll talk about them a little bit later, but the idea is that you can work on these puzzles and hopefully it'll give you an opportunity to touch the content a little bit differently and help prepare you for exams. Okay, moving on. So what we're talking about today is chapter 8. We'll be starting talking about memory. All right, so that's going to be the focus, memory. And we should note that learning and memory are highly related with one another. They're sort of integrated, intertwined with one another. When we learn something, the benefit of learning something is that we'll be able to access it later in our memory to use. That's key. Without it, then what's the point? So what we'll be looking at models of how memory works, encoding and effortful and automatic encoding and processing, sensory, short-term and working memory, long-term storage helped by potentiation, the hippocampus and the amygdala, encoding failure, storage decay, and retrieval failure, memory construction, misinformation and source amnesia, and then some tips and lessons for improving memory. We won't hit all of this in this session. Some of these items will be covered in the session later this week. So let's first start off by looking at studying memory. First, what is it? Memory is the persistence of learning over time through the storage and retrieval of information and skills. Persistence of learning, so we see that strong tie-in to the previous chapter, over time through the storage and retrieval of information and skills. And you are very familiar with various ways to show that our memory is functioning. 3 behaviors show that. First is recall. And recall is analogous to the fill in the blank type of exams and tests you've taken before. All right, you retrieve information previously learned and unconsciously stored. So you learned something and then it got stored. And now you can recall that information when you need it. Then there's recognition, very familiar with this one. This is a form of multiple choice exam in a sense. You identify which stimuli match your stored information. So you're looking at something and your task really is to be able to recognize the right one. And then there's relearning. Relearning is a measure of how much less work it takes you to learn information you had studied before, even if you don't recall having seen the information before. And we saw a little bit of an example of this when it comes to this midterm activity that we just talked about, that you covered chapters 1 through 6, the first part of chapter 6, and you had to, if you prepared for it, relearn some of that material before you took the midterm checkup activity. And if you did that and you realize it went much more smoothly than before, that's because you were relearning. It takes less work for you to relearn something than to learn it for the very first time. So how does memory work? Let's look at what we normally look at by way of memory models, and that's an information processing model. Here's a simplified description of how it works. We first have encoding. Here, the information gets into our brains in a way that allows it to be stored. Then the information is stored. The information is held in a way that allows it to later be retrieved. So we have to get some way to get it into our brains, then stored somewhere in our brains, and then have it retrieved. Reactivating and recalling the information, producing it in a form similar to what was encoded. So that's the basic premise. Very simple about how it works. Now, there's another way to look at it too, just adding a little bit more knowledge to the general base here, is connectionism information processing model. It focuses on an idea of a multi-track parallel processing, the processing of many aspects of a problem simultaneously, views memory as products of interconnected neural networks. And we'll see this idea pop up a time or two in this chapter as well as in future chapters too. That is an interconnected network of information. Then we have models of memory formation. This is the Atkinson-Shiffrin model that was developed all the way back in 1968. So in this model, we have the following. Stimuli out in the environment are recorded by our senses and held briefly in what we refer to as sensory memory. Then some of this information is processed into short-term memory and encoded through rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal, for example, we keep saying something over and over again. Let's say we're trying to remember a phone number or a password or something. We keep repeating it. That's what we call rehearsal. We're taking the stuff that's in short-term memory and trying to make it so that we'll have access to it later. So information then moves into long-term memory where it can be retrieved later. Okay, so those basically what we're talking about. We have stimuli and the environment, and that's going to be at first stage, it'll be sensory memory. And from sensory memory, we put it into short-term memory. And for short-term memory, we then go to long-term memory. So modifying the model a little bit here, more goes on in short-term memory besides just rehearsal. This is now referred to oftentimes as working memory. Some information seems to get straight from sensory experience into long-term memory and this automatic processing. So what we're seeing here, we're looking at this short-term memory, and we can refer to it also as working memory. But also we want to note that sometimes things skip all that working memory stuff and go straight to our long-term memory. Let's look at the graph at the bottom here, the little figure at the bottom. So we have these external events. You see my cursor there. And then it goes to automatic processing straight to long-term memory. All right. Then we have the following. Some of the stimuli we encounter are picked up by our senses and processed by sensory organs. This generates information which enters our sensory memory. So we see something and then we pick it up with our sensory receptors, and now we have it in our sensory memory. Before this information vanishes from sensory memory, we select details, and this is very important, we select details to pay attention to, and then send this information to working memory for rehearsal and other processing. So when you have a bunch of stuff visible to you, you make a decision to pay attention to something, to focus your attention on something, all right? That stuff that you're focusing your attention on will then be sent into working memory where you can process it further, all right? And that's the key idea. So working memory functions in the following way. It holds information not just to rehearse it for storage, but to process it. For example, hearing a word problem in math, keeping it in your mind, and solving the problem in your head. We can use auditory rehearsal, repeating a password to memorize it. We can use executive functions, choosing what to attend to or what to respond to. We have a visual-spatial sketch pad, rearranging the room furniture in your mind. All these things are happening in what we refer to again as your working memory. Rehearsing passwords, choosing what to focus your attention on, rearranging things in your bedroom in your mind or in your living room in your mind by moving your couch here and the coffee table there. All these things are taking place in this working memory. In addition, it also helps to integrate some new sensory information with long-term memory as well. So our working memory has a lot going on. It's very important to us. It's doing a lot of activities for us. Now let's look at studying memory dual track, and explicit and implicit. So this is a concept that we need to understand because we'll see it pop up a time or two in the next few chapters. All right, dual track processing, explicit and implicit memories. So far, we have been talking about explicit, declarative memories. These are facts and experiences that we can consciously know and recall. Okay, so we know that we know this information. We can declare, declarative, we can declare, I know that. All right. Our minds acquire this information through effortful processing, for example, studying, rehearsing, thinking about, and then storing information in long-term memory. For example, declarative knowledge would be something like this. Who was the first president of the United States? And you'd say George Washington. I declare that I know who the first president of the United States was. Okay, so the idea here, these are declarative memories, things that you explicitly know that you know. These are the facts. Explicit. Then we have implicit. Some memories are formed without going through all the Atkinson-Shiffrin stages that we talked about earlier. These are implicit memories, the ones we are not fully aware of and thus don't declare or talk about. We can't declare that we know everything in our implicit memory because it's implicit. We don't know that we may know it. Okay, these memories are typically formed through automatic processing without our awareness that we are building a memory. It happens automatically and without processing and working memory. So we skip again those Atkinson-Shiffrin stages that we just talked about. That's the key idea. So we have these two types of memories: explicit, declarative memories, and implicit memories, which we may have no awareness of. And we'll talk more about this in the next session as well. Now, let's look a little bit more closely at this automatic processing. Some experiences go directly to long-term implicit memory, okay? So these experiences occur and then they go to long-term implicit memory without us having to work on them. Here are some examples. We have procedural memory, such as knowing how to ride a bike, and well-practiced knowledge such as word meanings. They become part of a procedure, all right? And for example, procedural memory can also be thought of as things like muscle memory, okay? You learn a procedure. You learn a baseball bat swing or a golf swing or how to shoot a basketball at the free throw line. These are procedural memories. Sometimes when we try to think consciously about how to do some of these things, we mess up. That's when our coach may tell us, don't think about it, just do it. Don't think about it, because consciously, we're not supposed to be doing it consciously. It's part of our procedural, our muscle memory, and it does just well without us. Once we learn it, we have it, okay? And so our procedural memory sort of takes over. In addition to that, we have conditioned associations, such as a smell that triggers thoughts of a favorite place. Now, we talked about conditioned learning in the previous chapter. So what we're saying here is that some of the times when we have learned things through conditioning, we may not recall the episode where we learned it, but regardless, we are conditioned because this happens automatically. It goes from whatever experience we had to our long-term implicit memory, bypassing all those processing steps where we may have some more conscious awareness of it. So we don't necessarily have conscious awareness of what we've been conditioned to. Information about space, such as being able to picture where things are after you walk through a room. Information about time, such as retracing a sequence of events if you lost something. For example, you misplaced your keys. You sort of put yourself back in time to see where you were and retracing your events and steps. And then information about frequency, such as thinking, I just noticed that this is the third texting driver I've passed today. You weren't aware at the time that you were clocking how many people were texting and driving, but at some level you're processing it again automatically. So this automatically is very similar to the idea that we talked about in the previous chapter about the dual track mind. You have the low road, the high road, the road that we are consciously aware of and the one that we aren't. This is probably that one that we aren't. These things are going on without us necessarily being consciously aware of them. So let's look at the sensory memory real quickly here. Again, this is one of the things that we saw with the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. The immediate, very brief recording of sensory information before it is processed into short-term or long-term memory. Now, does anybody have an idea why do you think sensory memory would be very, very brief? Why we don't want our sensory memory to be very long? So when we talk about our sensory memory, what we mean by very brief, we mean the following. We very briefly capture a sensory memory analogous to an echo or an image of all the sensations we take in. How brief? Memory consists of about 3 to 4 seconds for an echo. That'll be auditory. Or about 1/20th of a second for an image. Okay. Evidence of auditory sensory memory called echoic memory can occur after someone says, what did I just say? Even if you weren't paying attention at that time, you can probably retrieve about the last 8 words from echoic memory because it's still rattling around in your head for a brief period of time. So the question I had there, and I'm going to wait to see if you guys can come up with an idea, why is it a good idea probably for our sensory memory to be brief? Think about it and see what you think. Any ideas? Think about it this way. If you look at a scene and then you close your eyes, the scene fades away. You have your eyelids closed now, and then whatever you're looking at, it sort of, you can see an after image and it starts to disappear. Now, it disappears quickly because it lasts about 1/20th of a second. But what if your sensory memory lasted longer? If your sensory memory lasted longer, let's say visually lasted longer than that 1/20th of a second, you would be getting interference. You'd be having double images all over the place because as you're looking at new stuff, the old stuff is still there. And it can become quite confusing. So images contain much more information than echoes. It would be overwhelming to us if all the details our eyes capture, okay, would still be there. We wouldn't know what to pay attention to. There'd just be too much information. So these sensory memories don't interfere with new images coming in. Otherwise, it'd just be too confusing. Everything would be blurry because we have all these double images all over the place. So the notion here is that the sensory memory, particularly for vision, which can have a lot of information, is this brief because we don't want to have this interference. It's one reason it's a good thing that it is a brief experience for us. All right. So evidence of visual sensory iconic memory, George Sperling's experiments, and we're going to actually do this, I believe. So George Sperling exposed people to a 1/20th of a second view of a grid of letters followed by a tone, which told them which row of letters to pull from iconic memory and recall. Without the tone, people recalled about 50% of the letters. With the tone, recall for any of the rows was typically 100%. To simulate Sperling's experiment, notice the 3 rows of letters below. Based on the color of the letters, you will know that you must recall one of the following rows: top, middle, bottom. Now, we've already done this, and you guys already have the key for it already in your notes, but I'm going to show it anyway, and you'll probably be able to realize that you can recall those letters just fine because you have been warned what row to look for, and it's going to be long enough in this 1/20th of a second for you to be able to recall it. And obviously, I don't want to even ask you guys because I know you guys know it. It was PGS. So what we see in this little brief demonstration is that we have that information long enough in our sensory iconic memory to be able to easily pull that information out. All right, so encoding capacity and short-term working memory. If some information is selected from sensory memory to be sent to short-term memory, how much information can we hold there? Most people are aware of the limitations of short-term memory by now, but George Miller proposed that we can hold 7 plus or minus 2 information bits. For example, a string of 5 to 9 letters. More recent research suggests that the average person, free from distraction, can hold about 7 digits, 6 letters, or 5 words. Let's do a test real quickly here. Depends on concentration. Despite this talent, it is generally a myth that we can handle 2 streams of similar information simultaneously. Test to see how many of these letters you can recall after they disappear. All right, so we can actually do this because I don't think this one showed up in your notes. Okay, here we go. So, can anybody recall all those letters? Type yes or no. Okay, so basically what it comes down to is that we will have a limit of our capacity, okay? And the letters were here, VM3CAQ9LD, all right? So the notion here is that we have limits on our memory, okay? That there is going to be a finite amount of what we can do. It depends on concentration. Despite this talent, generally, it is a myth that we can handle 2 streams of similar information simultaneously. We saw this previously when we talked about our consciousness in the previous chapter, that this idea of multitasking, for example, is somewhat a myth. All we're doing is toggling back and forth between 2 activities. So the duration of short-term memory, Lloyd Peterson and Margaret Peterson wanted to know the duration of short-term memory. And their experiment conducted way back in 1959, people were given triplets of consonants like VMF. To prevent rehearsing, the subjects had to do a distracting task, a common technique. If they don't want you to think about something, they give you another task to do so you don't think about VMF or whatever the other triplet consonants were. People were then tested at various times for recall. This is the result. After 12 seconds, most memory of the consonants had decayed and could not be retrieved. So we can look and see how quickly this happened. So on the left, we have the percentage of who recalled consonants. At the bottom, we have the time and seconds between presentation. By 9 seconds, we only have 20% recall. By the time we get to 12 seconds, it's just about 10% recall. So we've forgotten most of everything that had gone on previously. So short-term memory is just that. It is short-term. So it's limited in the amount of information we can store. It's also limited in how long it's going to be around. It will be short-term. So let's look at the processing, looking at effortful and mnemonics. All right, effortful processing strategies. This is where you're putting forth effort to try to be able to recall information later. So if we have short-term recall of only 7 letters, but can remember 5 words, doesn't that mean we could remember more than 7 letters if we could group them into words? Okay, that makes sense. This is an example of effortful processing strategy, a way to encode information into memory to keep it from decaying and make it easier to retrieve. This is also referred to people as studying. That's what you do when you're studying. You're trying to using effort to process your encoding of information so that later it will be easier to retrieve. All right, here are some examples of ways in which we can use effortful processing strategies. We have chunking, which is also grouping. We have mnemonics, images, maps, and peg words. We have hierarchies and categories. Rehearsal, especially let me do something with this, especially when it comes to distributed practice, deep processing, semantic processing, making information personally meaningful. All of these are ways that we can use effort to make our retrieval of information a little bit easier later. All right, let's look at chunking. Okay, why are credit card numbers broken into groups of 4 digits? 4 chunks are easier to encode or memorize and recall than 16 individual digits. For example, see if you can recall this. Can't. It's going to be very difficult for you to memorize that, all right? Chunking is organizing data into manageable units. So if we organize it into manageable units, we're going to break them up in some fashion or some form. So they're broken up here. But we can even do better than that. So that we chunked them, we broke them up, but we can even do it better if we make them meaningful in some way. So it works even better if we can assemble information into meaningful groups. And then if we do this, it makes sense. IDK, KFC, FBI, BA, NAACP, CVS, SUV, ROFL, NBA, and so on and so forth. The idea is that by chunking and then by making it meaningful, we'll have a much better opportunity and probability to retrieve that information when we need it later. So what you're seeing here is that this particular chunking done in a meaningful way is going to make it much more likely that you'll be able to recall the information later when you need it. How many people have used certain techniques like this before? Let me know. You don't have to say anything, but just say you've used the techniques before. I just want to see how often this stuff gets out there and people are actually using. It can be very, very beneficial. In fact, I know all of you know at least one of the techniques that, like a mnemonic device, Roy G. Biv. I'm sure we've used it before, but we know what Roy G. Biv is. If anybody knows what Roy G. Biv is, let me know that, okay? All right, so effortful processing, let me sweeten the pot for you. If somebody tells me what Roy G. Biv is on the chat, you get some extra points. Effortful processing strategy using mnemonics. Okay, we have the following. We can read plain, cigar, do, shall, candy, vague, pizza, seam, fire, and pencil. Okay. Which words might be easier to remember? Which words might be easier to remember? Well, we could write them down, write down the words you recall. In fact, do that now. Write the words down you recall, even though I know it's sort of a cheat because you guys have the notes already. All right. If you write them down and then you say the lesson, we encode better with the help of images. So if we had images, and some of these words are better imaged than others. We can come up with a picture for them. For example, we can come up with a picture of a cigar or pizza, okay, or pencil. We can't come up with a idea of vague or scene. So the ones that have images tied to them are the ones that most likely that you'll have better ability to recall. All right. So the idea is that we can see images are very powerful when it comes to being able to recall information later. Now, what is this thing called a mnemonic? A mnemonic is a memory, quote, trick that connects information to existing memory strengths such as imagery or structure. All right. Because we are very visual creatures, as we learned in the previous chapter, we are all about our vision, that we have a great deal of imagery. And if we can tie this stuff to imagery, we have a better chance of recalling information later. Then we have a peg word system. It refers to a technique of visually associating new words with an existing list that is already memorized along with numbers. For example, do can be pictured written on a door and a door equal 4. Now, I'm not going to go into details about it, but peg word system basically says you develop a system of, of words and numbers that you already have as an anchor to you, and then when you want to remember a list of items, you'll use that in some sort of visual way as a peg to those memories. And so that way you can learn a list, and then once you no longer need it, you just dump it, and you can use the same system again for another list that you need to be able to recall. Now, another way to do it is through hierarchies or categories. We're more likely to recall a concept if we encode it in a hierarchy or a branching nested set of categories. Below is an example of the hierarchy using some of the concepts we've just seen. So we talk about encoding and effortful processing. To the far left, we have sensory memory, okay, the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. Then we looked at capacity of short-term and working memory, where we can have maintenance, rehearsal, and do other things like what to focus our attention on. And then we have effortful processing strategies, chunking, mnemonics, and hierarchies itself. Now, we have done this already before. You may recall, for example, when we were looking at the nervous system in a previous chapter, we had this. Nervous system is broken down into peripheral and central. And peripheral is further broken down into autonomic and somatic. The autonomic is further broken down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So this hierarchy, these categories help us to recall this information later. It can be very, very useful. That's why oftentimes when you're graphically writing notes or keeping notes, sometimes it's a really good idea to use hierarchies to establish the relationships between the various concepts. Here's another way to do it. We see in this sort of like this diagram here, we see the effortful strategies sort of together, chunking, hierarchies, and mnemonics with sensory memory and capacity of short-term memory off to the side there. Another strategy is rehearsal and distributed practice. Okay, first we have our friend massed practice, cramming information all at once. It is not time effective. Okay, so mass practice or cramming does not get the job done. If you are able to survive it and pass the test, that information may not be available to you during that final exam, for example. So the spacing effect was first noted by Ebbinghaus. You will develop better retention and recall, especially in the long run, if you use the same amount of study time spread out over many shorter sessions. All right, so spacing, that's the spacing effect. Same amount of study time, just spread out over many shorter sessions. Okay, that will have the best bang for your buck, so to speak. This doesn't mean you have to study every day. Barak noted that the longer the time between study sessions, the better for long-term retention and the fewer sessions you need. So there are strategies out there that have demonstrated and have been researched that say this is the best way to prepare for you to learn certain types of material. So the best way to practice, consider the testing effect, also by Roediger, found that if your distributed practice includes testing, having to answer questions about the material, you'll learn more and retain more than you merely reread it. So the idea here is not just use spacing effect, but also use the testing effect. Spread it out over numerous sessions, okay, but also have testing yourself involved in it as well. Your performance will tend to improve. Then we have deep semantic processing. When encoding information, we're more likely to retain it if we deeply process even a simple word list by focusing on semantics or meanings of the word. All right, so let me give you an example that I think I may have shared with you once before. I used to do this all the time in my general psych classes. Usually one of the first classes or first class on memory, I would pass out a paper to everyone there, and they would have a list of words, and they would have instructions as to what to do with this list of words. Half the class would receive instructions to count the number of vowels in the word and write the number of vowels beside the word, and that's all there was to do. The other half of the class would say, think of the word as being pleasant or unpleasant to you and write a P for pleasant or U for unpleasant next to the word, and that's what they would do. They would do their assignments without talking to each other, and then I would collect all the papers up, and then I would do my lecture, okay, keeping them occupied for a while, and then I would tell them to take out a piece of paper and write down as many of the words they were able to recall that they could. And what we would find is this. Does anybody know which group remembered the most words? Was it the group that counted the vowels in the word, or the group that thought of the word as being pleasant or unpleasant? I'm going to wait for an answer. How long will I wait? You can type it if you're shy. So one group would count the number of vowels in the word. The other group thought of the word as being pleasant or unpleasant. And then later, after some time of lecture, they would try to recall as many words as possible. Which one, the pleasant, unpleasant, or the vowel counters, remembered the most words? Guess. Okay. All right, all right. Okay, cool. We have the same person here that said the pleasant or unpleasant. And that is indeed correct. You're getting lots of points today. All right, so the idea is this. The people who had to think of the word as being pleasant or unpleasant, they had to process the information more deeply, as opposed to the people who just counted the number of vowels that happened to be in the word. Therefore, when they recalled the information later, they had better hooks into the word. Therefore, they were able to recall it. So shallow, unsuccessful processing refers to memorizing the appearance or the sound of the words, but deep semantic processes that you did more thinking about the word or the meaning of the words. In this case, the meaning to your words, whether or not you thought truck was pleasant or unpleasant to you. All right, so the idea is that this is what we mean by having this deep or semantic processing. And so when you can, you give meaning to these things that you're trying to recall. You don't want to think of them in a shallow way. Think of them in a more meaningful, deeper way, and then you'll be able to recall them much more readily. So memorize the following words: bold, truck, temper, green, run, drama, glue, so on and so on. You can read them. All right, so if you were to ask to memorize those words, you go about trying to memorize them. All right, so another strategy is to make information personally meaningful to you. We can memorize a set of instructions more easily if we figure out what they mean rather than seeing them as a set of words. So you have to give meaning to something, all right? Memorizing meaningful material takes 1/10 the effort of memorizing nonsense syllables. So think about what that means. If you have a bunch of stuff that makes no sense to you, that you have no meaning whatsoever, it's more energy to recall and memorize those words. But it's less effort if they are meaningful to you. Think about that. Less effort if they're meaningful to you. Now, actors memorize lines and students memorize poems all the time. Okay, more easily by deciding on the feelings and meanings behind the words. So one line flows naturally to the next. So this is one of the reasons why actors want to get into the character. They want to understand the motivations. They want to understand the feelings of the character that they're playing. By doing so, they're going to remember the words of their dialogue much more readily and more easily. That's why they're doing it. It's going to help them to memorize their lines, and they get really good at that. So the lines become to them much more easily in this fashion. So then we have also something called the self-reference effect. The self-reference effect. What this is this: relating material to ourselves aids in coding and retention. And I used to tell this when I would have students come in for a session, an office hour or whatever. I would say when there is a concept or some sort of theory, and if you can come up with some way to relate it to a personal experience that you have had, that you went through, you're going to be much, much more likely to understand and give more meaning to that concept or that term, and then more readily, more easily recall that information when necessary. So that self-referencing effect is basically making that information personally meaningful to you. And that has a lot of power behind it. So if we know that and we know about the self-reference effect, now try again, but this time consider how each word relates to you. So if you had this task to actually do, you would try to figure out, okay, how you can make these words meaningful to you. Bold, truck, temper, green, run. And the ones that you have the ability to make more meaningful to you, those are the words I dare say that you would probably be able to recall much more readily and more easily. Okay? All right. So memory storage is the next thing that we'll talk about. We have a few more things to get through here and we'll wrap it up. So retaining information in the brain. Topics to keep stored in your brain: how we hold stories and stores, the explicit memory system, implicit memory system, the amygdala and the emotions and the flashbulb memories, and how synapses change to help store memories and long-term potentiation. All right, so memory storage, capacity and location. First of all, note this: the brain is not like a hard drive. Memories are not in isolated files, but are in overlapping neural networks. So there's not one place in your brain where you have the stored memory of your high school graduation or your last birthday party. That is not how our memory works. There's not one location for this. The brain's long-term memory storage does not get full. It just gets more elaborately rewired and interconnected. So our long-term memory is basically theoretically limitless. Okay, we have all the space we need there. Okay, because all we're doing is making the interconnected networks more and more and more and more elaborate. So we can just keep adding on. Now, Carl Lashley showed that rats who had learned a maze retained parts of that memory even when various small parts of their brains were removed. Lesson: stay away from Carl Lashley. No, the lesson is basically this: memories are not files found in single locations. So by removing parts, different parts of the brain of these rats, and they were still able to demonstrate their learning for their maze, he sort of gave strong evidence to suggest that they're not stored in one location. So memory is not like a file. And even though, to be honest with you, memory in the computer is not like that as far as I understand it. It is distributed all over the place. And that's the way it is to some extent with the brain. They're all over the brain, very dispersed, not a file in one single location. Now, explicit memory processing, okay? Remember, explicit is declarative memories, including facts, stories, and meanings of words such as the first time riding a bike or facts about the types of bicycles. Explicit memory, all right? So retrieval and use of explicit memories, which is part of the working memory or executive function, is directed by the frontal lobes. So this thing that we're talking about, our explicit memories, okay, part of our working memory and our executive function, it is directed by the frontal lobes. Encoding and storage of explicit memories is facilitated by the hippocampus. Events and facts are held there for a couple of days before consolidating, moving to other parts of the brain for long-term storage. And again, as we've talked about this before, much of this consolidation occurs during sleep. That's why a good night's sleep is very important, because a lot of things are happening when you're seemingly not doing anything. You're just sleeping. Well, no, what's going on? Your hippocampus, which has been holding some information for the last couple of days, is consolidated information and moving it on to long-term memory for storage, so you can retrieve it later date. So without the hippocampus, we could not form new explicit memories. All right. Some of you may recall a movie called, I think it's called 50 First Dates. Has anybody ever seen that movie before? 50 First Dates. I think it's Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore. Somewhat dated now, but it's been around for a while. There is a character there called 10-Second Tom, I believe. And 10-Second Tom, he's living at a memory institute. He has damage to his hippocampus, so he can no longer store things in his long-term memory. All he has available to him is his short-term memory. Hold for a second. Excuse me. I'm going to take some of the drink here. All he has is a short-term memory. Therefore, when he's introduced to people, by the time he's introduced to a long list of people, he would have forgotten already the people who started off that introduction. All he knows now by way of long-term memories is stuff that is already there. He cannot put any new information in there because of his hippocampus damage. All right. So then we have implicit memory processing. Implicit memories include skills, procedures, and conditioned associations, as we mentioned before. Here, we're just looking at where in the brain does this stuff happen to work. So here, it's the cerebellum. The little brain, the cerebellum, forms and stores our conditioned responses. So we can store a phobic response, even if we can't recall how we acquired the fear. That's where it's going to be stored. So the cerebellum is there. That's why we have these skills and procedures and all this type of stuff. That's why when we have, you know, that soap opera trope when someone's in a car accident and they hit their head and all of a sudden they have amnesia, that's going to be the frontal lobe and all that stuff that's been somewhat traumatized. And so they have no access to their episodic or their explicit memory, what they really know by way of facts and all this type of stuff. But if they are a surgeon and they don't know who they are, but they're a surgeon, they're around somebody who gets hurt, they can go in there and help. They can probably perform some surgery. Okay, they don't know who they are, but that skill, those procedures for the surgery are still in the cerebellum, which is not damaged, and they're just fine. So the memories and procedures are just fine there. So they can do the job, do the surgery. They just don't have any recall of when they acquired that surgery, or if they're afraid of a certain animal because of they've been conditioned in some way, they don't know when they got that fear. They don't know the event that may have led to it. Then we have the basal ganglia next to the thalamus, controls movement and forms the stores procedural memory and motor skills. We can learn to ride a bicycle even though we don't recall having the lesson. And of course, we have little Albert here. When they condition little Albert, he will have no recollection for a variety of reasons as to when this fear may have been instilled in him. Okay, but it's there resting in his cerebellum. Okay, then that takes us up right next to something that we've touched on a couple of times already, and that is infantile amnesia. Okay, infantile amnesia. All right, implicit memory formed from infancy can be retained. So this is the implicit memory. The cerebellum memory can be retained, including skills and conditioned responses that's resting in the cerebellum. However, explicit memories, our recall of episodes only goes back to around 3 years or so. Prior to 3 years of age, we are really not remembering, really. Most likely, if you remember when you were 2 years old, you're just retelling a tale that has been told to you by someone else. Because most oftentimes you will not be able to remember an episode that is an episode from your life at such an early age for a variety of reasons. So we have this nearly 3-year blank in our memories, and this has been referred to as infantile amnesia. So the explanation, encoding. The memories were not stored well because the hippocampus is one of the last brain areas to develop. Remember, the hippocampus is required for us to consolidate our memories. And then we have forgetting retrieval. The adult mind thinks more in a linear verbal narrative and has trouble accessing pre-verbal memories as declarative memories, okay? And so there's a whole variety of reasons too. So we also have the understanding that two important elements are a theory of mind. We don't have that until later in our development, as well as object permanence. So we see there are a variety of reasons why we may have this infantile amnesia in place. Now, emotions, stress hormones, the amygdala in memory. How does intense emotions cause the brain to form intense memories? All right, well, emotions can trigger a rise in the stress hormones. These hormones trigger activity in the amygdala. Remember, amygdala is where we have a lot of our emotions centered. The amygdala increases memory-forming activity and engages the frontal lobes and the basal ganglia to tag memories as important. So when something that's very significant and intense happens, it sort of like puts a stamp on it and says, this is important. Tag it, remember it. So as a result, the memories are stored with more sensory and emotional details. We sort of turn it up to 11, okay? These details can trigger a rapid, unintended recall of the memory. Now, this can be a bad thing too, because this is basically the same type of structure that happens to some extent when someone is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. The memory comes back in great detail with all the emotion and all the fear and terror that was there the very first time, as when it was tagged, this memory is important. So we see this can happen and can be very problematic as people have to deal with that. So we see emotions can be tagged as being very significant. Now this leads to this as well. Emotions and memory. We have these flashbulb memories. They refer to emotionally intense events that become burned in as a vivid seeming memory. Now it should be noted that this flashbulb memory, they are not as accurate as they feel. It doesn't say anything about the accuracy, but it does say something that the memories are very intense and they may feel accurate, but they may not be as accurate as we think they are. So things could be a little bit different. All right. So let's look at the brain processing of memory. All right. So we look at synaptic change. Remember the synapse between the neurons here. When sea slugs or people form memories, their neurons releasing neurotransmitters to other neurons across the synapse, the junctions between these neurons. With repetition, the synapses go what they call long-term potentiation because they get getting used over and over again. and signals are sent across the synapse more efficiently, so they become much more efficient. The synaptic changes include a reduction in the prompting needed to send the signal and an increase in the number of neurotransmitter receptor sites. And that's what we see here below and to the right. Okay, that's what that image is supposed to be. So what that takes us to is this: messing with long-term potentiation. So this is what they've discovered. They want to try to interfere with this thing they refer to as long-term potentiation, and they want to see what the result actually is when we do that. And this is what they found. Chemicals and shocks that prevent long-term potentiation, or LTP, can prevent learning and even erase recent learning. So they've found that if they do something to prevent LTP, the organism or animal may not be able to learn, or if they have learned something and they do this chemical or shock to this LTP, they will erase their recent learning, like with a big old eraser, and just erase that memory altogether. Preventing LTP keeps new memories from consolidating into long-term memories. For example, mice will forget how to run a maze. So they know how to run a maze, and we've proven they can do it, and then we do something to their LTP, and we can sort of erase that memory. And what they've also found is that drugs that boost LTP help mice learn a maze more quickly and with fewer mistakes. So this long-term potentiation does appear to have some impact and some influence on our memory. Now, to summarize the types of memory processing, as we sort of wrap things up for today, we have memory processing. We have the automatic memory processing, where we have implicit non-declarative memories. And this is the type of memories that we may have no conscious recall of. This is going to be processed in the cerebellum and basal ganglia. And such things that are going to be processed automatically are going to be things dealing with space, time, and frequency, where you ate dinner yesterday, motor and cognitive skills, procedure like riding a bike, and classical conditioning, reactions to a dentist office. So you may have a fear for it. You may not remember how that was acquired, but it's there. That's all part of the automatic processing. Then we have effortful processing. This is dealing with explicit memories, declarative, things that you have conscious recall of. This is processed in the hippocampus, where we have the stuff being held for a couple of days before it's moved on to long term, and the frontal lobes. And then what we have here is facts and general knowledge. This chapter's concepts, for example, or the last chapter's concepts, and things which are personally experienced events, like family holidays. Let me talk about the personal experience. We'll talk about this as episodic memories. It's almost as if every major event in your life, or thing that you recall in your life, is your episode from your personal TV show. And this way you can sort of recall it. That's your personal episode. And of course, you can remember your episodes of your TV life, okay? And when you can do that, it's part of your declarative memory. And a little bit later, when we talk about forgetting and things like amnesia, this is the part of the memory when one has a certain type of amnesia that they forget. Like I was saying about the soap operas, they bump their head and they don't know who they were. They don't remember their last family holiday. They may have other types of memories available to them, but not their personally experienced memories, which would include their name. All right, are there any questions or comments for today? Okay, we'll be picking this up on our next session, finishing up this chapter. And that's it for today. If there's no other comments or questions, you guys are free to skip that. And I have one person who's got some extra points. All right, thank you for responding. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.